My school life was hell because of bullying. My advice on how I survived it. Hey, Reddit. I never thought I'd be the kind of guy to post here, but I guess everyone has that moment where their past catches up with them. Mine came out of nowhere last week. I was grabbing coffee before work, minding my own business, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. I turned, and there he was, Chris Benson. The guy who made my high school years a living hell. He looked the same, just older. Same smarmy grin, same arrogant posture, but now with a receding hairline and a cheap suit that didn't quite fit right. And the second he saw me, his expression changed. It was like he had seen a ghost. Maybe in a way he had. High school was over a decade ago, but seeing Chris brought everything back in an instant. The insults, the punches, the humiliation, all of it, like it had never left. I wasn't the same kid anymore though. I had moved on, built a life, became someone. But for a few seconds, I felt like that 17-year-old loser again. And that's when I knew I had to get this off my chest. So here I am, writing about it. Maybe someone out there needs to hear this. Maybe I just need to say it out loud. Either way, this is the story of how I survived the worst years of my life, and how I made sure they didn't break me. High school wasn't just bad for me. It was an all-out war zone. From the moment I walked into freshman year, I might as well have had a target on my back. I wasn't a bad-looking kid or weird in any extreme way, but I was quiet. That was enough for them. Chris Benson and his crew picked up on that fast. They were the kind of guys who could smell weakness, and to them, being quiet meant you were weak. It started small, like it always does. Snide comments in the hallway. A well-placed foot to trip me when I walked past their table. Stupid crap. But that was just the warm-up. By sophomore year, it escalated. They had this whole routine worked out. Chris was the ringleader, obviously, but his little sidekicks, Ethan, Jake, and Ryan, played their parts perfectly. One would distract the teacher while another stole my homework and copied it, then trashed it before handing it back. They spread rumors too, made up garbage about how I was creepy, or weird, whispering it just loud enough for girls to hear. Then came the physical stuff. It wasn't like some after-school special where they shoved me into lockers every day, but it was worse in a way. They'd pass by me in the halls and just casually throw an elbow into my ribs, acting like it was an accident. Chris once walked past my desk, knocked my books onto the floor, and smirked at me while the whole class laughed. And God help me if I even looked at a girl they were into, because then the real fun started. One time, I made the mistake of helping a girl named Sarah pick up her notebook when she dropped it. She smiled, said thanks, and that was it. But Chris saw. The next day, he spread a rumor that I had been caught staring at her in the locker room. I had never even been in there, but that didn't matter. For the next month, people called me Peeping Tom, and made disgusting jokes every time I walked by. The teachers? Useless. Either they didn't notice or they didn't care. A couple of times I tried to say something, but I was always met with the same tired response. Just ignore them, they'll get bored. Spoiler alert, they didn't. I spent most of my high school years counting down the days until I could get the hell out. But the worst part? I hadn't even hit rock bottom yet. That would come soon enough. I don't know what flipped the switch, but at some point Chris and his guys stopped pretending they weren't doing this on purpose. The cheap shots in the hall turned into straight-up punches. Not enough to leave marks that would get them in real trouble, but enough to make my life miserable. The worst one happened in the gym locker room. It was winter, and we had to change out of our regular clothes into these ugly schoolish gym uniforms. I was doing what I always did, keeping my head down, changing fast, avoiding eye contact. But I guess that wasn't enough for them. Chris strutted over with his usual smirk. Hey, loser! You forget how to shower, or do you just like smelling like a dumpster? I ignored him. That was my rule. Don't react, don't give them anything to work with. But Ethan decided he wanted a turn. I think he's scared to take his shirt off. What do you think, guys? Maybe he's hiding something? Before I could do anything, Ryan and Jake grabbed my arms, yanked my shirt over my head, and shoved me forward. I slammed into the cold metal lockers, my bare skin stinging from the impact. The laughter echoed around the room like a damn sitcom laugh track. "Damn, dude," Chris chuckled. "You're even scrawnier than I thought." I gritted my teeth, face burning, forcing myself to stay still while they kept going. Chris pounded a fist against my back, hard enough to hurt but not enough to leave a mark. Just enough to let me know he could. Then, as if to make sure I never forgot, he leaned in and whispered, "You don't belong here." I don't know what hit me harder, the physical pain or the realization that deep down, I was starting to believe him. Getting punched and shoved sucked, but at least it was predictable. I could brace for it, push through, survive. But then they took things to a whole new level, one I never saw coming. It started with missing assignments. I wasn't stupid. I knew I had done the work. But somehow, my homework kept disappearing between my locker and the classroom. Teachers started giving me warnings, saying I was slipping, and that I needed to take responsibility. Yeah, right. Like responsibility could stop Chris and his guys from pulling this crap. Then, the real setup happened. One day, I was sitting in history class, minding my business, when Mr. Jacobs, the vice principal, stormed in, looking pissed. "Come with me," he barked. The whole class stared as I got up, my stomach twisting into knots. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew it wasn't good. When I got to his office, I saw Chris already sitting there, looking all innocent, like butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. Next to him? Mrs. Carter, our English teacher, arms crossed and glaring at me like I had just kicked her dog. "Do you have something you'd like to tell us?" Jacobs asked. I shook my head. I don't know what you mean," Mrs. Carter scoffed. "Don't play dumb. Chris told us everything. We know you stole the answers to last week's test." I swear my brain short-circuited. "What? That's insane. I didn't steal anything." Chris, the lying sack of garbage, sighed like he was just so disappointed. "Look, man, I didn't want to rat you out, but you put me in a bad spot. Mrs. Carter said she'd fail the whole class if nobody came forward." The audacity. The absolute audacity. Jacobs leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Son, we have witnesses." "Who?" I snapped. "Ryan and Jake confirmed they saw you sneaking into Mrs. Carter's office." I almost laughed at how ridiculous it was. Almost. But the look on Jacob's face told me this was real. They actually believed this garbage. I spent the next hour fighting for my life, swearing up and down that I had never even been near Carter's office. But it didn't matter. I didn't have proof I didn't do it, and they had Chris's smooth lies on their side. The only thing that saved me from suspension was my lack of a prior record. But I still got detention for attempting academic dishonesty. Chris walked past me after the meeting, smirking. "Careful, man. Wouldn't want people thinking you're a cheater and a liar." I had never hated anyone so much in my life. Up until that point, I had taken everything they threw at me. The rumors, the shoving, the stolen homework. I swallowed it all because I thought that was the only way to survive. But after they nearly got me suspended over a lie, something inside me cracked. It happened a few weeks later. I was in the cafeteria, sitting alone, trying to just get through another miserable lunch. I was barely paying attention when I heard my name. "Hey, loser." "Chris." "Of course." I didn't look up. I figured if I ignored him, he'd move on. But no, that would have been too easy. He sat right across from me, his little minions gathering around. The air shifted, and I knew something was coming. "You know, I think you've been looking a little too comfortable lately," Chris said, grabbing a fry off my tray like he owned it. "Maybe you forgot your place." I clenched my jaw. "Screw off, Chris." The second the words left my mouth, the whole table went silent. I had never talked back before. And Chris? Oh, he was loving it. "Oh," he laughed, nudging Ethan. "You hear that? Big man's finally growing a spine." Ethan grinned. "Too bad it won't help him." And then, before I could react, Chris grabbed my drink and poured it all over my lunch. Just dumped the entire thing onto my food like it was nothing. That's when I lost it. Before I even knew what I was doing, I grabbed my tray and slammed it into his chest, knocking him straight onto the floor. The whole cafeteria gasped. Chris stared up at me, completely stunned. I could feel my heart hammering, my blood boiling. Every single punch, every shove, every insult, I was done. For the first time in my life, he was the one caught off guard. Chris scrambled to his feet, face red with anger. You little... I didn't wait for him to finish. I stood up so fast my chair nearly toppled over. Come on, then, I snapped. You want to do this? Let's do this. He hesitated. For the first time ever, he hesitated. Maybe he thought I'd just take it like I always had. Maybe he saw something in my eyes that made him second-guess himself. Either way, he didn't swing. But the damage was done. Teachers rushed in, grabbed us both, and dragged us to the principal's office. I knew I was screwed. But for the first time in years I didn't care. Because for once, Chris was scared of me. Sitting in the principal's office, I braced for the worst. Chris, ever the golden boy, put on his best innocent act. He just went crazy, he said, shaking his head like he couldn't believe it. I was just joking around, and he snapped. I don't know what his problem is. I let out a bitter laugh. Of course. Of course that's how he'd play it. Principal Daniels sighed, rubbing his temples. Chris, I have multiple reports of you and your friends harassing him. This isn't the first time your name has come up. Chris's eyes widened, all fake shock. Harassing? No way, sir. We joke around, but it's never serious. We're just messing with each other. I clenched my fists. Messing with each other? This guy had spent years making my life miserable, and now he wanted to act like we were buddies? Daniels turned to me. Look, I get it. You've had enough. But reacting with violence doesn't help. You're both getting detention for the rest of the week. I almost argued, almost pointed out how completely unfair that was. But what would be the point? Chris would just lie his way out again. So I took the detention. The news spread like wildfire. By the next day, half the school was whispering about how I had snapped and attacked Chris. Some people laughed. Some girls suddenly looked at me like I was interesting. And some guys I barely knew gave me approving nods in the hallway, like I had finally earned their respect. But Chris? Oh, he was pissed. I had humiliated him. And if I thought that was the end of it, I was dead wrong. Because the worst was yet to come. For a brief moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, I had won something. Chris wasn't as loud after that. His little comments were quieter, his jabs less frequent. I knew he was pissed, but I figured after what happened in the cafeteria, he'd think twice before coming at me again. I was an idiot. Because Chris wasn't the kind of guy who let things go. No, he was the kind of guy who waited, who planned, who made sure his revenge hurt. It happened about a week later. I was just starting to think things were settling down. I was walking to class when I saw Sarah, the same Sarah I had once dared to help pick up her notebook, standing with some of Chris's friends. She wasn't laughing with them, though. She looked upset. Then she turned, spotted me, and her face twisted into something I didn't understand. There he is, she said, voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Stay away from me, freak. I froze. The hallway went silent. People started whispering. I felt my stomach drop. What? I managed. Sarah folded her arms. Don't act dumb. You sent me those disgusting messages. My brain short-circuited. What messages? Chris strolled up behind her, shaking his head. Dude, that's low even for you. I wanted to punch him right there. I wanted to rip that smug look off his face. But I was too busy trying to understand what the hell was happening. Sarah, I said carefully, I didn't send you anything. She scoffed. Really? Then how do you explain this? She yanked out her phone and held it up. And there it was. A string of disgusting messages, sent from an account with my name. Messages talking about how I watched her, how I dreamed about her, how I wanted to do things that made my stomach turn just reading them. I felt sick. Chris let out a dramatic sigh. Guess we know why you were staring at her all the time, huh? I didn't even try to explain. No one would believe me. That was the worst part. The whispers turned into full-blown conversations. By lunchtime I was the creep. Girls avoided me. Guys laughed. And Chris? Chris just sat back and watched his masterpiece unfold. And for the first time in my life, I realized something. This wouldn't stop until I stopped it. Let me know when you're ready for part 8. I barely made it through the day. Everywhere I went, people stared. Some whispered, some just gave me disgusted looks. Even the teachers started acting different, like they had already made up their minds about me. By the time I got home, I was shaking with rage. I sat on my bed, staring at the wall, my mind running in circles. How had it come to this? How had Chris won again? But the more I thought about it, the more something inside me shifted. Chris had spent years making my life hell. He had stolen my homework, beaten me up, turned people against me. And now? He had just made sure I was completely alone. So what did I have to lose? That night, I made a decision. The next morning, I walked into school differently. Head up. Shoulders back. I wasn't going to let them break me. Not anymore. The first test came almost immediately. As I walked past Chris's table in the cafeteria, he smirked and said, "Surprised you even showed up, creep." Normally, I would have ignored him. But not today. I stopped, turned to face him, and said, "What's wrong, Chris? You nervous?" His smirk faltered. "Nervous about what?" I smiled. "Oh, nothing. Just funny how you're always 2 steps ahead, huh? Like you just knew Sarah was gonna get those messages. Almost like you were expecting it." A few of his friends shifted uncomfortably. Chris narrowed his eyes. "You trying to accuse me of something?" I shrugged. "I dunno. Just weird how this keeps happening. How I get accused of stuff I never did. Almost like someone's making sure of it." People were listening. Chris could feel it. He forced a laugh, but I could tell I had gotten under his skin. "Whatever, man. No one's gonna believe you." I just smiled. "We'll see." And I walked away, feeling lighter than I had in years. I wasn't going to play defense anymore. It was time to hit back. I knew I couldn't just call Chris out and expect people to believe me. He had spent years making sure everyone saw me as a joke, a punching bag, a loser. No one was going to suddenly flip sides because I threw out some vague accusations. I needed proof. So I got to work. First, I started paying attention. Chris had been careful up until now, but cocky people always get sloppy. I watched the way he talked to people, the way he manipulated them. I saw how he'd whisper something to one of his friends, and suddenly a rumor would start. How he'd set people up, then sit back and enjoy the show. Then I found my opening. One day after school I caught Jake, one of Chris's minions, alone by the vending machines. Unlike Chris, Jake wasn't all that smart. He just followed along because it made him feel important. I walked up casual. "Hey, man." He tensed up. "What do you want?" I pulled out my phone and opened the fake messages that had been sent to Sarah. "You know, these are really interesting." Jake glanced at them, then rolled his eyes. "Yeah? So what?" I smirked. "So, Chris made a mistake." That got his attention. "What?" "See, if I really sent these, there'd be some kind of proof. A login from my account, a timestamp that matches my phone activity. But there isn't. Because I didn't send them." I leaned in. "And I bet if someone were to, I don't know, check the school computers, they'd find out exactly who did." Jake swallowed. I could see the gears turning in his head. He was realizing, maybe for the first time, that Chris wasn't untouchable. That if I went down, there was a good chance Chris would drag all of them with him. I don't know what you're talking about, he muttered, but he wouldn't look me in the eye. Sure, I said. But just in case? You might want to start thinking about who you'd rather take the fall, me or Chris. I walked away before he could respond, but I knew I had gotten to him. The cracks were starting to show, and it was only a matter of time before the whole thing fell apart. A few days passed, and I kept my distance. I didn't push Jake for answers. I didn't have to. I just let the tension simmer, knowing he was probably talking to Chris's other friends, wondering what the hell was going on. But the real breakthrough came the next morning in class. I was sitting at my desk, trying to focus on the lesson, when I noticed Chris talking to Ethan and Ryan in the back. They were whispering, and I could see the frustration on Chris's face. It wasn't hard to guess what they were talking about, me. And I was right. By the time the bell rang, Chris didn't meet me in the hall like usual. Instead, he stayed back, talking to Mrs. Carter. She was the teacher who had always sided with him, the one who had spread the rumor that I cheated. So when she came out of the classroom looking pissed, I knew something had changed. As I walked to my next class, I saw Ethan leaning against the wall, a nervous look on his face. He saw me coming, and for the first time ever, he didn't smirk. Hey, he said, glancing over his shoulder. You need to talk to Chris. I raised an eyebrow. About what? He shifted uncomfortably. He's in trouble. My heart skipped a beat. Finally, I followed Ethan to the stairwell, where Chris was waiting, pacing back and forth. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by that tight, nervous energy I'd seen in him when things weren't going his way. Dude, you gotta stop this, Chris said before I could even speak. I didn't mean for this to go so far. I stood there, just staring at him. Really? Because it sure seems like you've been trying to ruin my life for years. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration clear on his face. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I was just messing with you, man. It was supposed to be a joke, okay? I shook my head, my voice low and steady. You think humiliating someone is a joke? Making their life a living hell is funny to you? Chris looked like he was about to say something, but then, instead of yelling back, he deflated. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw him as just a kid, scared and in over his head. I didn't think it would go this far. I didn't mean for Sarah to get involved, or the fake messages. He paused, looking at me like he expected me to feel sorry for him. I thought if I kept you down, I'd stay on top. That was when it hit me. This wasn't about me. It was never about me. It was about Chris's insecurity, his need to stay in control, to feel powerful by taking someone else down. But the worst part? I realized I had been doing the same thing by letting him walk all over me. I'm done, I said. I'm not playing this game anymore. And just like that, it was over. The consequences catch up. It didn't take long for the truth to start leaking out. It wasn't me who cracked first. It was Ethan. The next morning, I walked into school to see people whispering about something, and the whispers were loud enough that I couldn't ignore them. When I turned the corner, I saw Chris, looking like he had just been dragged through a storm, standing with Mrs. Carter and Principal Daniels. Ethan stood nearby, looking guilty but determined. Chris, I heard Daniels say, his voice like a hammer. We have a lot to talk about. For once, Chris wasn't the one in control. I just stood back and watched as Ethan explained everything, the fake messages, the manipulation, the lies. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Ethan had cracked, spilling details about how Chris had planned to set me up, how he dragged others into his mess. I almost felt sorry for Chris, but I pushed the thought away. This was his fault, not mine. By the end of the day, Chris was suspended for a week. Mrs. Carter, who had always been his defender, suddenly didn't have anything to say. No one defended him anymore. When I saw him at school the next week, he didn't look at me. He couldn't. His minions had scattered, no one was laughing at my expense, and his confidence was completely gone. That's when I realized the power dynamic had shifted. It wasn't about who had the most friends, or the loudest voice anymore. It wasn't about the jokes or the taunts. It was about something deeper, the ability to stand up and say, "Enough." And that was something I had finally learned how to do, building myself up. In the weeks that followed, things started to feel different. Not just at school, but inside me. The tension that had clung to me for so long began to fade. It was like I had been walking through a storm, just waiting for it to end. And now, for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. I made a conscious choice to focus on the things that made me feel good about myself. The things that were mine and weren't tied to the judgment of anyone else. I joined the track team, something I'd always wanted to do but never had the confidence for. The first day, I almost backed out. What if I wasn't fast enough? What if people laughed? But I pushed through it, because the old me wouldn't have. The old me would have stayed silent. But not anymore. It wasn't easy. I wasn't the fastest guy on the team, or even close, but I kept showing up. And every day, I pushed myself harder. Something unexpected happened too. People started noticing. Not just the teachers, or the athletes, but everyone. I had a few guys who had once called me a freak approach me, offering a nod or a quick word of respect. And that felt like more of a victory than any race I'd ever run. But what really surprised me was the girls. Some of the same girls who had once avoided me started talking to me, no longer because they felt sorry for me, but because they actually wanted to. That was a strange feeling, to be wanted, to be seen for who I really was. It wasn't like I had suddenly become some golden boy, but I had finally earned some respect. And that meant everything to me. Chris? Well, he came back from his suspension a little more humbled. He still tried to act like he was in charge, but people weren't buying it anymore. His little group of followers scattered, and suddenly, no one was afraid of him. In the end, it wasn't some huge confrontation that broke him. It was just the slow realization that he couldn't control everyone anymore. That maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as untouchable as he thought. I wasn't angry at him anymore. In fact, I kind of felt sorry for him. He'd spent all that time trying to tear me down, and for what? To make himself feel better? It was a hollow victory, one that didn't last. But for me, the real win came in knowing that I was better than all that. Better than the bullying, the lies, the harassment. I was finally strong enough to stand on my own, and no one could take that from me. The unexpected ending. As the weeks went on, I started noticing something strange. It wasn't anything big, just little things here and there. Chris wasn't just avoiding me, he was actually trying to be me. At first, I thought I was imagining things. But then I saw it for myself. One afternoon, I passed him in the hallway, and he was talking to a group of kids who used to bully me. And he was trying to do what I had done, take the high road, make jokes that weren't cruel, even join in on the track team to prove he could change. It was like watching a bad version of myself, trying to imitate the person I'd become. But it didn't sit right with me. At first, I was tempted to laugh. After all, wasn't this karma? Wasn't it just poetic that Chris, the guy who'd spent years making my life miserable, was now trying to wear the mask of someone he had tried to destroy? But as I watched him, something else occurred to me. This wasn't my victory. It was his. For once, Chris was trying to break free from his own prison. The walls he'd built around himself, the ones that kept him in control and everyone else beneath him, those were the same walls that had kept him trapped in his own fear. He was trying to escape, just like I had. I started to feel bad for him. Not because I forgave him. I would never forget what he did to me. But because I realized something. Hurt people hurt people. Chris had been miserable for a long time, and I had been a target of that. He didn't know how to cope, how to deal with his own insecurities, so he pushed them onto others. He had no idea how much damage he was causing. It wasn't my responsibility to fix him. But I could stop being angry. So I let go. I stopped looking for revenge. I stopped trying to prove I was better than him. And weirdly enough, as I let go of all that bitterness, my life just kept getting better. People started coming to me for advice, or just to hang out. I was finally part of something, real friendships, built on respect and mutual support. And then, out of nowhere, I got a message from Chris. It was short. Just a few words. "I'm sorry." I sat there for a long time, staring at it. My first instinct was to brush it off, but I didn't. I thought about how I had felt when I was in his shoes. How lost I had been, how angry. So I just wrote back. "Thanks. But it's in the past now. Take care of yourself." And just like that, I was free. I never expected to come out of all of this with a lesson like that, but I had. I learned that there's power in forgiveness, not because people always deserve it, but because it's the only way you can truly move on. So, to anyone reading this who's been bullied or is struggling with someone like Chris, hold your head up. Focus on what you can control. Build your own strength, your own life. And if they ever come back to you, just know you don't need to hold on to the past to define who you are. You get to choose your future. Looking back, I'm amazed at how far I've come since high school. It feels like a lifetime ago, but I still carry a piece of that experience with me. The whole thing was a wake-up call, not just about other people but about myself. For the longest time, I let my anger define me. I let the things Chris and others did to me become my identity. I thought I had to be tough, that I had to fight back, prove that I wasn't weak, that I wasn't a victim. But in reality, the real power came when I stopped fighting them. When I stopped letting their actions dictate how I saw myself. I learned how important it is to be your own person, to stand up for yourself, but without letting that need for revenge consume you. It's easy to fall into the trap of holding on to bitterness. But if you carry that weight for too long, it's just you who ends up hurting. Not the person who wronged you. Not Chris. The moment I realized that, everything changed. I was able to build something real. And it wasn't just about the friends I made or the respect I gained at school. It was about being okay with who I was. The things that happened to me didn't define me, they just helped shape the person I was becoming. Sometimes I wonder if Chris ever figured that out. Whether he ever stopped trying to control people and started learning how to live without tearing others down. Part of me hopes he did. I'm not angry anymore, and I don't hold on to that part of my past. I'm not the same guy who showed up on the first day of high school, scared and unsure of himself. That guy? He's long gone. I wish I could say I had some dramatic ending with Chris, like me standing on stage, telling everyone how I triumphed over him, but life doesn't really work like that. The ending wasn't loud or flashy. It was quiet. It was a shift in how I saw myself and how I moved forward. It was about realizing that the best revenge is living well. I learned that, in the end, people can only hurt you if you let them. They can only control you if you let them. And once you stop giving them that power, they're nothing. They're just people who are dealing with their own stuff, just like you are. So, my advice to anyone in a situation like mine? Don't let them win. Don't let them make you think you're anything less than you are. Get up. Keep going. Build yourself into someone who doesn't just survive, but thrives. And when they try to bring you down again, walk away. Don't waste another second on their cruelty. In the end, the real victory wasn't about getting revenge, or making them apologize, or even getting people to like me. It was about becoming someone who no longer needed validation from anyone but myself. And that's the most powerful thing of all.